66 years. That is how long she performed the role. Not lived it, performed it. And the performance was so complete, so technically flawless, that when she finally died in March 2002, at the age of 101, the country wept like it had lost its grandmother. Flags lowered, tributes poured. The BBC cleared its schedule. 200,000 people queued in the cold to file past her coffin, some of them waiting 12 hours for 30 seconds beside a woman they had never met and believed they knew completely. They did not know her at all. Here are the numbers they did not read at the funeral. 4 private secretaries dismissed without public explanation across her lifetime of royal service. An estimated £4 million in personal household debt quietly absorbed by the civil list, meaning absorbed by you, the British taxpayer, while the official story remained one of dignified, modest public service. One woman who, across 6 decades, engineered the permanent social exile of a family member using nothing more lethal than a seating plan, a withheld title, and the freezing withdrawal of a smile. When a tech CEO gets caught cooking the books, we call it fraud and film the perp walk. When a Hollywood executive silences inconvenient witnesses, we call it a cover-up and make a documentary. When the palace needed an inconvenient truth buried, a debt hidden, a relationship punished, a reputation quietly demolished, it reached for something older, quieter, and infinitely more effective than any NDA ever drafted in a Los Angeles law office. It reached for her. The woman the world called the Queen Mother, the nation's grandmother, the last great symbol of wartime courage and aristocratic grace. The woman in the pastel coats and the impossible hats who waved from balconies and charmed every room she entered and remembered every name and never, not once in 66 years of public life, allowed anyone to see what was actually happening behind the warmth. What was actually happening is what this is about. She was born in August 1900, and the world she was born into did not prepare her for hardship. It prepared her for expectation. Glam's Castle, Angus, Scotland. Stand in that entrance hall. 14-foot ceilings, walls thick as a fist, portraits of ancestors staring down with the calm authority of people who have never once been told no. This was not a house, it was a statement. The Bowes-Lyon family, Earls of Strathmore and Kinghorn, were not royalty, but they were the kind of old aristocracy that looks down at royalty from a very comfortable distance and finds it slightly nouveau. They had land, lineage, servants, and the absolute unshakable confidence of a family that had never needed to explain itself to anyone. Elizabeth was the 9th of 10 children, which sounds like the recipe for a child who learns to fight for attention. In ordinary families, perhaps. In aristocratic ones, the youngest are spoiled with almost competitive dedication. She and her younger brother David were the babies of the household, and they were treated accordingly. The governess handled the lessons. The nursery staff handled the inconvenience. The kitchen handled the meals. The housekeeping staff handled the mess. From the very first morning of her conscious life, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon inhabited a world where discomfort was something other people managed on her behalf. That is not a detail. That is the entire architecture of what she became. She was not the family beauty. That distinction belonged to her sister Mary. What she had was something rarer and considerably more dangerous in a social world run entirely on impression. She had presence. Warmth that she could switch on like a lamp in a dark room. Wit that arrived exactly when needed and never overstayed. The ability to make whoever she was speaking to feel, genuinely feel, that they were the most interesting person she had encountered all week. While behind those bright, attentive eyes, she was filing everything they said with the quiet precision of a barrister building a case. She learned this young. Some people do. The First World War arrived on her 14th birthday, and Glam's Castle was converted into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers. The sheltered daughter of Strathmore was suddenly moving through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and dread, past men who had left for France whole and returned in pieces. Her brother Fergus was killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915. She was 15. She helped where she could. Letters written, hands held, small dignities restored to men the war had stripped of larger ones. The war did not break her. It educated her in something the nursery never could. She learned that suffering, managed correctly, is one of the most powerful social currencies in existence. She learned to keep her face composed when the room needed composure, to perform steadiness when the room needed steadiness, to offer sympathy with such practiced grace that the recipient never noticed the sympathy was also a form of control. Not cruelty, craft. There is a difference, though from the outside the results can look identical. By the early 1920s, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon had become one of the most sought-after young women in London society. She was charming, she was well-connected, she was funny in the way that makes men feel clever for laughing, and she moved through drawing rooms and country house weekends with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing for exactly this her entire life. Men noticed. She noticed the men noticing, and she was in absolutely no hurry. Prince Albert, second son of King George V, Duke of York, known to his family as Bertie, had been trying to get her attention since at least 1920. He was not the obvious prize. That role belonged to his older brother Edward, Prince of Wales, who was handsome and modern and magnetically restless in the way that makes crowds fall in love and families lose sleep. Bertie was the other one. Shy, conscientious, crippled by a stammer so severe that public appearances were a form of controlled suffering. He had been raised in a royal household that treated emotional warmth as a structural weakness, and the damage showed in his nerves, his self-doubt, his desperate need to be steadied by someone who knew what steadiness looked like. Elizabeth saw all of this clearly. That mattered. He proposed. She refused. He proposed again. She refused again. The exact number of rejections has been smoothed over by decades of sympathetic biography, but the essential truth is not in dispute. She made a future king wait, and she used the waiting to think with complete clarity about what she was being asked to accept. Not romance, a life sentence inside an institution that ate people. The royal family in 1922 was not a warm place. George V was a disciplinarian who expressed affection the way certain men hang a picture, occasionally, crookedly, and with visible effort. Queen Mary was magnificent and glacial in equal measure. The court ran on ritual, hierarchy, and the unspoken understanding that your private self was now the property of the institution. Elizabeth had grown up spoiled, yes, but spoiled people understand comfort, and the palace, beneath its gold ceilings, was not comfortable. It was a machine. She needed to know she could run it before she agreed to live inside it. She accepted him in 1923, and love was present. Genuinely, this was not a cold transaction dressed in lace. But love was not the only occupant of that decision. There was calculation. There was ambition of a very specific, very disciplined kind. Not the ambition that announces itself, the ambition that waits. Their wedding at Westminster Abbey gave the public their first glimpse of how she operated. On the way into the Abbey, she stopped at the tomb of the unknown warrior and laid her bouquet. For her brother Fergus, killed at Loos, 1915. The gesture was real, the grief was real, and it was also, and this is the thing about her that you must hold in your mind for everything that follows, perfectly, instinctively, devastatingly timed. Not performance instead of feeling, not feeling instead of performance. Both, always both, from the very first public moment to the very last. The crowd outside Westminster Abbey wept. The newspapers called it the most moving gesture of the ceremony. And Elizabeth Bowes Lyon now Duchess of York, walked into her new life, having already demonstrated, to anyone paying close enough attention, exactly what kind of woman the royal family had just invited through its doors. The kind who understands that the right gesture at the right moment is worth more than a decade of quiet loyalty. The kind the palace had never quite encountered before, and would spend the next 80 years never quite knowing how to handle. Walk into the private apartments at Buckingham Palace in 1930. Not the staterooms, not the gilt and the chandeliers and the portraits designed to make visiting dignitaries feel appropriately small. The private rooms, the ones where the performance stops and the actual business of being royal gets done behind closed doors. Listen to what is happening in there. A man is rehearsing a speech. The same sentence, again, again. The stammer catching on consonants like fabric on a nail, tearing the word apart before it can leave his mouth. An equerry stands nearby, face carefully neutral, trained to register nothing. And in the corner of the room, composed, watching, quietly directing, his wife. This was the daily reality of the Duke and Duchess of York in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Not the public image of the charming young royal couple, the pretty Duchess, the dutiful Duke, the two small daughters, photographed on immaculate lawns at Royal Lodge. The reality was a man held together, in significant part, by the woman beside him, and a woman who understood precisely what that dependency was worth. Bertie's childhood had done serious damage. George V fathered children the way certain men manage employees, with high standards, low warmth, and the unspoken conviction that difficulty builds character. It built something in Bertie, but character is a generous description for what a frightened boy becomes when nobody in his household is permitted to be frightened. He emerged from that childhood anxious, self-doubting, and possessed of a stammer so entrenched that speech therapists who later worked with him described it as one of the most severe cases they had encountered, rooted not in mechanics, but in dread. Elizabeth arranged his treatment. She researched therapists, managed his schedule around sessions, sat through rehearsals, calibrated the emotional temperature of every room he was about to enter. She encouraged, yes. She soothed, yes. But she also drove him, quietly, consistently, with the particular relentlessness of someone who understood that a husband who cannot function in public is a ceiling, and a husband who can is a horizon. That is not a romantic observation, it is a structural one, and she was nothing if not structural. The staff saw it most clearly. Ladies in waiting who accompanied them on public engagements described the extraordinary gap between what the crowds witnessed and what happened in the car immediately before and after. In public, ease, warmth, the impression of a couple who found royal duty as natural as breathing. Behind the car door, detailed debrief, precise notes on what had worked and what required adjustment, the whole apparatus of a woman running a man's public life with the quiet efficiency of a chief of staff who had decided, very early, that her name would never appear on the organizational chart. She humanized the Windsors, the newspapers said. She softened the dynasty. Both true, neither complete. She also made herself indispensable to the one person whose position determined her own. Bertie adored her with the consuming gratitude of a man who had been reassembled by someone else's hands. He relied on her judgment in social situations, leaned on her in moments of public pressure, and drew from her presence a courage he could not independently generate. She knew this. You cannot tend a dependency that carefully without knowing it exists. And she tended it with the dedication of a woman who understood that being needed, truly needed, at the center of power is the closest thing to holding power that a woman in her position was permitted to claim. Not control for its own sake, not cruelty, something more refined and considerably more effective. She had built the instrument. The question was what the instrument was about to be asked to play. Edward VIII has been handed more romantic mythology than almost any monarch in British history. The king who gave up his throne for love, the man who chose the woman over the empire. It sounds extraordinary. It was, in every practical sense, an act of extraordinary selfishness, and the woman who understood that most completely, most permanently, most lethally was Elizabeth. The logic of the abdication crisis compressed into something brutal and simple. A king cannot marry a twice-divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands. The Church of England, of which the king is supreme governor, cannot sanction the union. The government, led by Stanley Baldwin, will not survive the attempt to force it through. Therefore Edward must choose, the crown or Wallis Simpson. He chose Wallis. Read that again. The King of England chose a woman over an empire, walked away from the throne his family had spent decades trying to stabilize, and handed the wreckage, still smoking, to his younger brother, who had spent his entire adult life dreading exactly this moment. Bertie wept when Edward told him. Elizabeth did not weep. Not then. Family accounts from that period describe her as absolutely still. The particular stillness of a person who has just watched a controlled detonation and is already calculating the structural damage. Her hands were steady, her face was composed, and somewhere behind those composed features, the moral account book of the House of Windsor was opening to a fresh page, and she was picking up the pen. She never put it down. Her hatred of Wallis Simpson is one of the most documented personal hostilities in the history of the British royal family. Not rumoured, documented, in letters, in staff testimony, in the accounts of ladies-in-waiting who watched her deploy it with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who understood that the best revenge operates on a very long timeline. She referred to Wallis as that dreadful person, not in hushed private conference, with the calm openness available exclusively to women so armoured by rank that they never need to bother with euphemism in front of allies. But what the palace biographies consistently frame as principled constitutional concern was also, undeniably, unmistakably, personal. Wallis had threatened everything Elizabeth had spent 15 years carefully constructing: her husband's stability, her position, her carefully managed future, and she had done it with the audacity of a woman who felt she had every right to be exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing, without apology or deference to the rules of a game she had never agreed to play. That last part was what Elizabeth could never forgive. Not the divorce, not the nationality, the audacity. The HRH question crystallized everything. When Edward abdicated and became Duke of Windsor, the convention would normally have extended the style of Her Royal Highness to his wife upon marriage. George VI, advised, supported, and in this matter almost certainly steered by Elizabeth, denied it. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, would be addressed as Her Grace, not Her Royal Highness, a distinction invisible to most of the world and absolutely devastating in the world that mattered. Revenge dressed as constitutional principle. The target could not protest without appearing to prioritize personal vanity over public duty. The punishment was unanswerable. The woman who designed it was never required to acknowledge it existed. Like a modern political smear campaign, the kind run not from a war room in Washington, but from a drawing room in Windsor, over perfectly poured tea, in complete silence, with a smile that never once wavered. The PR machinery moved in 3 coordinated steps. Edward's departure was framed not as a love story, but as a dereliction. A man who chose appetite over obligation, selfishness over service. Bertie and Elizabeth were positioned not as ambitious inheritors, but as reluctant, morally superior victims of someone else's failure. And that version, victim as hero, sacrifice as qualification, was institutionalized so thoroughly in the official record, repeated so consistently by sympathetic biographers and obedient courtiers, that it became the only version most people ever encountered. The financial cost was immediate and substantial. Edward's household arrangements required restructuring. The new king's establishment expanded. The machinery of monarchy, now running through Bertie rather than his brother, required significant resource. All of it absorbed, none of it discussed. The reputational cost fell entirely on Wallis, permanently, specifically, without reprieve. She was excluded from every inner circle Elizabeth administered for the rest of her life. When the Duke died in 1972, Wallis attended his funeral at Windsor, frail and diminished, a woman in her mid-70s who had watched 36 years of social exile fail to produce a single moment of reconciliation from the sister-in-law who controlled the temperature of every room she entered. Elizabeth performed the formal courtesies required by a state funeral. Nothing more. Nothing that could be mistaken for warmth. The human cost belonged to Bertie, a man who had not asked for the crown, did not want the crown, and was handed it in circumstances calculated to make him feel, for the rest of his life, that he was wearing someone else's mistake. He carried that weight for 16 years. It aged him in ways a doctor could measure and a wife could watch, up close, every morning. She watched, she steadied him, she pushed him forward, and she never, not once, stopped keeping the account. 12th May, 1937. Coronation morning. The private apartments at Buckingham Palace before the procession assembles. The new King George VI stands before a mirror in full ceremonial dress. The uniform, the orders, the weight of every piece of it pressing down on a man whose hands are not yet steady and whose stammer is a live thing behind his teeth, coiled and waiting for the worst possible moment to announce itself. His face is the color of cold ash. His breathing is controlled in the specific way of someone controlling it deliberately, because the alternative is visible panic. His wife is in the room. She is adjusting something, a detail of ceremony, a small choreographic note about what comes next. She is already running the sequence. Her face is composed, her hands are still. She is, by every observable measure, completely ready. Not because she was fearless, because she had been preparing for something like this, in one form or another, since the morning she accepted Bertie's proposal, and understood that a stage was part of what she had agreed to manage. The coronation succeeded on every level it needed to succeed on. It was magnificent. The music, the robes, the ancient cadences of a ceremony designed to make even skeptics feel that something larger than politics was taking place. But magnificence was not the achievement. The achievement was something more specific and considerably more difficult. Elizabeth did not appear to have arrived at Westminster Abbey by accident and scandal. She appeared born to it. The impression of a woman wholly, naturally, inevitably in her place was manufactured across months of precise public positioning, wardrobe strategy, and the management of every appearance, every photograph, every public gesture in the year following the abdication. Courtier accounts from 1936 and 1937, documented in the Royal Archives, describe her management of the transitional period as relentless in its detail. Which engagements would rehabilitate the monarchy's image most efficiently? Which photographs conveyed the correct emotional register? How Bertie's public appearances should be sequenced to build confidence incrementally rather than expose him to the largest stages before he was ready for them. She did not crave the crown in any simple, grasping sense. That reading is too easy and too flattering to her critics. What she craved was the legitimacy that comes from appearing not to crave it. A far more sophisticated hunger, and one considerably harder to satisfy because it requires the permanent cooperation of everyone around you in maintaining the fiction that it doesn't exist. The coronation delivered that legitimacy, publicly, completely, before an audience of millions. The ceremony caught up with the reality she had already established. It always does, for women who are patient enough to build the reality first. September 1940. The Luftwaffe has been over London for 3 consecutive nights. In the East End, Stepney, Poplar, Bermondsey, whole streets have come down. Families are pulling furniture from rubble. Children are being evacuated in the dark. The smell of the city in those weeks is plaster dust, gas leak, and the particular cold of buildings that no longer have roofs. In this city, in this moment, a woman in a pale blue coat steps out of a car on a street that was a row of houses 48 hours ago and is now a gap in the skyline. She walks toward the people standing in what remains of their neighborhood. She meets eyes. She stops. She listens. She does not flinch. The hands reaching for hers are shaking. Hers are not. That is the image that made her legend. And the legend is not wrong. It is incomplete. Because the courage was real, the visits were relentless, the stamina required to move through that level of human devastation day after day without the face cracking was genuine and formidable. But courage, in Elizabeth's hands, was never only courage. It was currency, and she understood its exchange rate with a precision that should take your breath away. When Buckingham Palace took a direct hit in September 1940, bombs falling in the quadrangle while the King and Queen were in residence, her response was swift, calibrated, and has been quoted in every biography written about her since. She was glad the palace had been bombed, she said, because now she could look the East End in the face. Pause on the structure of that sentence. Not, I finally understand what you are going through. Not, we are suffering alongside you. The feeling described is positional. She now had the right to stand beside the bombed poor. The bombing of the palace had conferred legitimacy, and she saw that, registered it, articulated it, deployed it, in the immediate aftermath of a bomb strike on her own home. That is not the instinct of a woman simply processing shock. That is the instinct of a woman who experiences every event, including her own near death, in terms of what it means for her standing. The physical reality of those palace visits was managed with the same precision as everything else in her public life. Protection officers who accompanied her through bomb sites in those years later described the extraordinary performance of the transition. The warmth sustained for crowds, regardless of what had happened in the car beforehand, the capacity to absorb hours of human devastation and emerge from each engagement appearing energized rather than depleted. The ability to remember a name mentioned once in a conversation 6 months earlier and deploy it at exactly the moment it would mean the most to whoever heard it. The crowds got the performance, the staff funded it. One former equerry, interviewed decades after leaving royal service, described the particular exhaustion of working for someone who distributed warmth in public with apparently limitless generosity and demanded an entirely different standard in private, as though the emotional output given to strangers had to be recovered somewhere, and the recovery happened at the expense of the people closest to her. Not sympathy alone, not duty alone. Power, expressed through the precise management of meaning, one carefully timed gesture at a time. The wartime visits were real. The suffering she witnessed was real. The connection she made with ordinary people across those years had genuine substance and produced genuine comfort. Documented in letters sent to the palace from bereaved families who described encounters with her as the moment something shifted. None of that is in question. What is also not in question, and what the official record prefers to leave quietly to one side, is that she understood exactly what she was building. The wartime queen who stood in the rubble, the woman who stayed when she could have gone, the palace that took a bomb the same as a terraced house in Bermondsey. These were not simply experiences she lived through, they were assets she accumulated, and she knew, with the clarity of someone who had been calculating social capital since she was old enough to understand that a smile was a weapon, precisely what they were worth. The war made her beloved. What beloved made possible is the part of the story that comes next. Find the photograph, June 1953, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. She is standing in full ceremonial dress, the robes, the diamonds, the whole magnificent apparatus of a family that has learned to weaponize splendor. She is smiling. Of course she is smiling. She has been smiling for public cameras since 1923, and the mechanism has never once failed her. The smile is warm, complete, apparently effortless. Every person who sees that photograph reads the same thing in it. A proud mother, a beloved matriarch, a woman at peace with her place in history. Look closer. What that photograph actually captured, what nobody in the crowd outside Westminster Abbey and nobody reading their morning newspaper the following day had the interior information to see, was the precise moment Elizabeth's entire adult architecture became obsolete. Her daughter was now sovereign. The role Elizabeth had spent 30 years building, refining, and defending with a ferocity she never permitted anyone to name directly. Indispensable consort to a dependent king, the warm, necessary centre around which the monarchy's emotional life organized itself, was finished, closed. The chapter did not end gradually. It ended on a single day in June, in an abbey full of cameras, with a crown placed on someone else's head. She was 52 years old. She had been the most important woman in the British monarchy since 1937, and in the space of a single ceremony, she became the previous one. The grief of losing Bertie 14 months earlier had been real. Whatever complexity lived underneath their marriage, she had loved him with the particular depth of a woman who had made someone her life's central project, and watched that project slowly destroyed by the job she helped place upon him. His death in February 1952, at 56, had left her genuinely hollowed. The letters she wrote in those weeks, to friends, to household staff, to members of the public she had never met, carried an authenticity of loss that no amount of performance training could have produced from nothing. But Elizabeth did not stay hollowed for long. She was not built for hollowness. By June 1953, standing in that photograph with that smile, she was already constructing the next version. Already deciding what the Queen Mother would look like, how she would move through the world, who would be included in her orbit, and, critically, who would not. The grief was real. The reconstruction was simultaneous. Both things true, both things happening at once, behind a face that showed the world only what it had been trained to find reassuring. That capacity to feel genuinely and to calculate simultaneously, to grieve and to strategize in the same breath, was the defining quality of her interior life. And nowhere was it more visible to those who knew where to look than in the years immediately following the coronation, when the machinery of the Queen Mother turned its attention to the problem it had been quietly circling for months. Princess Margaret, Captain Peter Townsend, and the question of whether the family that had built its entire post-war moral authority on the foundation of duty and sacrifice was prepared to watch that foundation crack from the inside. It was not. Townsend was a decorated RAF officer, equerry to the late king, trusted inside the household in the way that only people who have survived proximity to royal grief tend to be trusted. He was also divorced. His marriage dissolved in 1952, a year before the crisis fully surfaced. And Margaret, vivid and reckless, and constitutionally unsuited to the quiet management of feeling that her family treated as a basic social skill, was in love with him in the way that makes everything else look like furniture. The protocol logic was merciless in its simplicity. Townsend was divorced with a living former spouse. The Church of England, of which the new Queen was supreme governor, could not sanction the marriage. Government approval, required under the Royal Marriages Act, would not be given without constitutional crisis. Therefore Margaret had to renounce him, or renounce her royal status and her civil list allowance, and step outside the circle entirely. 3 steps. No exits. The machinery moved with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had solved this category of problem before and had not enjoyed the experience. Townsend was posted to Brussels, an appointment framed in the language of diplomatic duty and understood by everyone involved as elegant removal. Margaret was left in London with her feelings and the company of a family that expressed sympathy through the management of inconvenience rather than the acknowledgement of pain. The Queen Mother's role in this has been softened in most accounts into something that looks like reluctant maternal concern, a mother torn between her daughter's happiness and her duty to the institution. The evidence suggests something less torn and more decided. She believed, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had accepted her own sacrifices as the price of a position she valued above almost everything else, that rank imposed obligations. That private feeling was a luxury the institution could not afford. That Margaret's pain, however real, was not more important than the architecture of a monarchy still rebuilding its credibility after the abdication. She had paid. She expected her children to understand that payment was the nature of the arrangement. Margaret waited. The newspapers speculated. The public, when they finally understood the shape of the situation, felt sympathy in the instinctive way of people who recognize that a young woman is being asked to sacrifice something genuine for reasons that serve everyone except her. In 1955, Margaret issued her statement. She would not be marrying Peter Townsend. She accepted the teaching of the Church. She understood the demands of her position. The words were hers. The architecture that produced them belonged to the institution. And the woman who had done more than anyone else to maintain that architecture, who had built her entire life on the proposition that the Crown's requirements superseded personal desire, received the outcome without visible relief and without, as far as any surviving account documents, a single private acknowledgement of what it had cost her daughter to deliver it. Here is what widowhood looked like for the woman the country called its grandmother. Clarence House, London, a royal residence staffed by a household that at various points employed over 100 people to manage the daily requirements of one elderly woman. The castle of May in Caithness, the most northern castle on the British mainland, purchased in 1952 and restored at considerable expense as a private retreat, because the Queen Mother's idea of a modest withdrawal from public life included a 15th-century castle overlooking the Pentland Firth with a full complement of staff and a garden maintained to exacting standards. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, retained as a weekend residence. A racing operation, horses, trainers, stables, the full professional apparatus of a serious owner, pursued with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a passion and the budget of someone who had never fully believed the concept of too expensive applied to them personally. She ran at an overdraft. For decades, the household debts accumulated with the serene consistency of a woman who experienced the gap between income and expenditure as someone else's administrative problem. By the time of her death in 2002, the financial arrangements required to sustain her lifestyle had been quietly restructured multiple times. Civil list adjustments, family transfers, accounting arrangements that the palace preferred to describe in the most general possible terms to anyone who thought to ask. £4 million is the figure that has emerged from the reporting done since her death. The actual figure may be higher. The palace's preference for financial opacity makes certainty difficult, which is, of course, precisely the point of financial opacity. The official story ran as follows. The Queen Mother represented continuity. She embodied the traditions of a great institution. The cost of maintaining those traditions was the cost of maintaining the monarchy itself, and the monarchy was beyond price. It is a very convenient argument. It is also the argument of someone who has never had to choose between the heating bill and the horse. She was not vulgar about money. Vulgarity requires a consciousness of money as something finite and consequential, and Elizabeth had never developed that consciousness because nothing in her first 100 years of life had required it. She experienced luxury not as excess but as atmosphere, the correct conditions of important life. The flowers had to be right, the silver had to be right, the food, the wine, the service, the rooms, all of it had to meet a standard that had been established in a Glamis Castle nursery in 1903 and had never subsequently been revised downward. The staff absorbed this. as they always had, as they had been absorbing it since the first lady-in-waiting learned which moods could be mentioned and which had to be managed around. The households that served her across 60 years of widowhood and royal service operated under the particular pressure of working for someone who was publicly beloved and privately exacting, where the warmth dispensed to strangers had to be balanced somewhere in the ledger, and the balancing happened behind closed doors, in service corridors, in the careful navigation of a woman's preferences by people whose own preferences were structurally irrelevant. The Duke of Windsor died in May 1972 at the Bois de Boulogne villa outside Paris. Wallis, by then a woman in her mid-70s and in significant physical decline, travelled to Windsor for the funeral. There are photographs of the two women in proximity, formal, correct, the surface courtesies of a state occasion observed with the precision that occasions of that kind demand. Nothing underneath the surface changed. 36 years of social exile, title denial, and the patient administration of exclusion did not soften into reconciliation because a man was being buried. Elizabeth attended to the necessities and maintained the temperature she had maintained since December 1936. Wallis returned to Paris. She died there in 1986, 14 years after her husband, in a house full of his possessions and the accumulated evidence of a life lived largely outside every circle that had once mattered. Elizabeth outlasted her by 16 years. This too felt like a verdict she had delivered rather than a coincidence she had survived. Meanwhile, the public image held. More than held, it deepened, calcified, became something close to national mythology. The pastel coats, the hats, the gin and dubonnet at noon, reported with the affectionate tolerance reserved for lovable eccentrics, rather than the scrutiny applied to ordinary people with drinking habits and household debts. The racehorses, the 100th birthday flypast, the appearance on the Buckingham Palace balcony at the Golden Jubilee celebrations in 2002, weeks before her death, the crowd below generating the kind of noise that functions as a form of collective love. She stood there and received it with the ease of someone who had never doubted it was owed. Not performance anymore, not technique, something that had long since moved past both into the territory of absolute, unexamined certainty. The world arranged itself around her preferences. It always had. Why would it stop now? The answer, when it finally came, did not arrive as public reckoning or financial exposure or the kind of institutional accountability that might have applied to any other individual running a £4 million deficit on the public account. It arrived as it always does for women of her particular category of power. Quietly, behind closed doors, with every surface kept polished and every difficult truth kept firmly in its place. She was still smiling. She died on the 30th of March, 2002, a Saturday afternoon, Royal Lodge, Windsor, in her sleep, which is the death the very fortunate and the very powerful tend to receive. Quiet, private, without the indignity of public collapse. She was 101 years old. She had outlasted her husband, her sister-in-law, her younger daughter's marriage, 3 monarchs, 6 prime ministers, and every single person who had ever tried to hold her accountable for anything. The country grieved with the sincerity of people who had lost something they couldn't quite name. 200,000 of them queued in the cold to file past her coffin. The tributes described her in the language reserved for figures who have ceased to belong to their own biography and entered the larger story a nation tells about itself. Courage, continuity, grace, dignity, the last living link to a Britain that may never have existed quite as cleanly as she made it appear, but which felt, in her presence, entirely real. That was her masterwork, not the wartime visits, not the hat, not the smile. The masterwork was making people feel that something true and solid and worth preserving was standing in front of them, when what was actually standing in front of them was one of the most accomplished performances in the history of public life. Now close the ledger and read what is actually written in it. The financial cost, £4 million in household debt absorbed by public arrangement, by civil list adjustment, by the kind of quiet family accounting that never appears in any document written for external eyes. A racing operation, multiple residences, a household staff of over 100, a standard of living that would have bankrupted any ordinary family within a decade, sustained across 50 years of widowhood by a combination of public funding and institutional silence. The woman publicly celebrated for wartime austerity, for ration book weddings and bombed palace stoicism, spent her private life treating economy as an insult she was too well bred to acknowledge. The reputational cost. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, spent 36 years in social exile, administered with such precise, sustained, unanswerable elegance that most of the people observing it never fully registered it as punishment. A title denied, a circle closed, a temperature maintained, across decades, in every room Elizabeth entered where Wallis's name might surface. The campaign required no lawyers, no press releases, no public statements. It required only the consistent, patient withdrawal of acceptance from a woman with no institutional standing to demand it. Wallis died in Paris in 1986, in a house full of her husband's possessions, having never once been permitted back inside the warmth. The human cost. Bertie, King George VI, consumed by a job he never wanted, driven through the last years of his life by a woman whose need for him to function was inseparable from her love for him, dead at 56, with lungs destroyed by cigarettes and a constitution broken by 16 years of performing a role that had been placed on him by his brother's selfishness and held in place by his wife's will. Margaret, bright, volatile, emotionally honest in a family that treated emotional honesty as a character defect, denied the first man she loved on the grounds of institutional necessity, delivered by a mother who had built her entire moral authority on exactly that kind of sacrifice, and then left to make the acceptable choice, which destroyed her quietly over the following decades in ways the renunciation never quite had the chance to do. The staff. The private secretaries who learned which thoughts to keep behind their teeth. The ladies-in-waiting who absorbed decades of icy withdrawal behind the public warmth. The protection officers and equerries who navigated the gap between the woman the crowds received and the woman who existed in the hours between engagements. They signed nothing that bound them to silence. The silence was enforced by something older and more effective than any legal instrument. It was enforced by rank, by the understanding, absorbed so early it felt like instinct, that some people exist to be served and some people exist to serve, and the distance between those categories is not a matter for discussion. She was not the saintly old darling of sentimental memory. The saintly old darling is a construction, maintained by sympathetic biographers, enabled by a press that found the grandmother image more useful than the audit, and underwritten by a public that wanted the comfort of the legend more than the discomfort of the reality. She was not a monster either. That reading is too simple and too satisfying, and therefore too wrong. Monsters are comprehensible. They announce their nature. They give you something to point at. What Elizabeth was is considerably harder to process and considerably more important to understand. A woman of genuine courage and systematic selfishness, real warmth and permanent cold, public generosity and private viciousness, refined to a point so sharp it rarely left visible marks. Not villain, not saint. Something the 20th century produced in very small numbers and almost never recognized while it was still in the room. A woman who understood power completely, its textures, its instruments, its long games and its short ones, and who exercised it, without interruption, for the better part of a century, while the world looked at the hat and called it charm. She wore the crown, not the official one, never that, but the real one, the invisible one, built from necessity and nerve and the long, cold patience of a woman who understood that control rarely announces itself. She built it across a lifetime. She defended it without mercy. She never apologized for it. The palace gates closed behind her cortege on a Saturday in March 2002, and the story the institution had spent 66 years maintaining closed with them. Neat, polished and arranged, as everything in her life had been arranged, exactly as she would have wanted it. What does it cost a family and a nation to keep one woman's legend polished and intact? And now that you know what the smile was holding together, whose side are you actually on?